If you've been in the industry for any length of time, really, you'll recognize that change is a constant, whether that's libraries, frameworks, processes, whatever it might be. And of course, test automation is not going to be any different in that regard. This presentation is a story about how I instigated a change around tooling approach at a company I just joined. So I have been, to some degree, involved in test automation for over 20 years, using lots of different libraries, frameworks, as you see on the screen. And in that time, as well, of course, of making lots and lots of mistakes, I built some ideas, opinions, and biases around what good test automation looks like. And I don't think a lot of those biases will be too different from a lot of people in the audience, whether that's whole team discovery, whole team effort, optimizing for feedback. Perhaps one that's maybe a little bit different is around the use of Cucumber, although it's probably more of a love-hate relationship that people can have with Cucumber. Whenever you look at the Cucumber homepage, you have this idea, as it describes on the screen, that because you can write your tests in plain language, anybody can contribute to the test automation. So improving ideas around communication, collaboration, and trust. Now, don't get me wrong, I am all for those things. Ideas around having collaborative discovery, of having your test automation actually act as living documentation of the behavior of the system. These are all good things. The question is, of course, do you actually need Cucumber for some of those? So, writing good Gherkin, despite what it can seem sometimes like, involves a little bit more than just putting words on the screen. Again, from the Cucumber site, there are some guidelines about implementing scenarios in a way that actually helps maintainability. But the idea being that your scenarios should describe the intended behavior and not the implementation. Our users come to our websites to book a hotel, to make a payment on an invoice, to make some sort of reservation. They do not come to click on a button. They may have to, but they don't come to do that, or select from a drop-down, or wait for an element to be displayed. In other words, as it says, your scenarios should describe what and not how. If we take a little look at a comparison between these two things, first of all, we have this what scenario. And obviously, login is a little bit contrived, but you have this user, you've got some context. The user is an active admin. They have access. They log in with their valid credentials, and they are then redirected to the admin dashboard. We compare that to a how scenario, where immediately, one thing is we've lost the context. Who am I as the user? You've lost that context immediately. But also, you're opening a website, you're clicking a button, you're typing values into a field. What happens whenever this flow changes? What happens if the mechanism to actually access the website changes? You've got a lot of heavy coupling of the implementation. You've got tests that are actually in the language of the UI and not the language of the domain, not the language of the business. Some of that, of course, is a little bit of a gap between how things could be, perhaps how things should be. There's some things that are a little bit more inherent to Gherkin. And some of these things, Gherkin can act as an enabling constraint, but there's things where it's just a constraint. If you're looking to define variables, you might have to go through some sort of contorted steps to store them off, bring them back in, or use the world object, and potentially add a lot to your cognitive load. Something else that I think occurs a lot is the reality of step definitions. So a lot of the time, we see, at least based on my experience, we see kind of very procedural step definitions. We see someone coming along, they see they want to do something quite similar. Maybe they just need to add a variable. So they take the whole step definition, they add the variable, copy, paste, and then before you know it, you have an explosion of step definitions. But I think if I were to have something on the screen that explained mostly where I am, it would be this quote from Luke Daly. Our applications are going to evolve over time. Our understanding of the application is going to evolve over time. Our ideas about how to implement and reflect our ability to explain the scenarios is going to change over time. And I think having code all the way up, all the way down, helps support that evolving over time. Okay, so what? You might be thinking, so what, you don't like Cucumber? So a couple years ago, I was interviewing for a position, the company I'm still with. But relatively early on in the process, I discovered, of course, that they were using Cucumber. And I remember thinking at the time, based on some of the opinions, but based on previous experience, I wonder how long it will take me to get rid of Cucumber. Now, I was joining as the most senior test automation person, but you can't just come in and start changing. In fact, it's almost a requirement that you don't. You need to spend a little bit of time observing, understanding the context. As Jerry Weinberg talks about in Secrets of Consulting, things got that way because they got that way. There's usually a series of decisions that led to this point. If you're going to try to change things, that context probably still exists. You need to deal with that context. There are probably still good things in there that you want to keep. So even if you are going to change some things, you probably don't want to be changing everything. There's still some value in there. But of course, it wasn't just Cucumber. In this context, Cucumbers are orchestrator, our test runner. We actually need something to actually interact with the browser. In this case, they're using Selenium. And on the screen earlier, it may not have been obvious, but I've been using Selenium in some capacity for nearly 15 years. Selenium is great, but it's a library and not a framework. It is a library that automates browsers, and that's it. So, of course, all these blog posts or talks or even workshops where people are doing comparisons between Selenium and Playwright or Selenium and Cypress, they're really false comparisons. They're not like for like. You're not comparing like for like. But Selenium is something where if you're trying to use it directly, you probably need to put something around it. Of course, a runner, a reporter, and so on. But a lot of time, and I've done this myself a long time ago, what you will see a lot of the time is people put some kind of element wrapper around the low-level element that you might use. And that was the case, what I could observe in the company I joined. So yes, they're using Cucumber, but they had also built some of these element wrappers themselves in an attempt to deal with the things that people who have used Selenium directly will have experienced. Some of those issues with stale elements, some of those race conditions on expectations. These are things that have been popularized as being solved with the likes of Playwright. But in terms of the implementation that we had, things were a little bit leaky. So they'd done a good job, but I would say not a perfect job. So we still had sometimes stale elements. We still had issues around race conditions, and sometimes at the cost of performance. And then in terms of thinking about how to create maintainable and stable test automation, one of the most important things we can do is have control of how we set up state. So being able to intercept or mock API responses for the browser, being able to, for example, intercept calls to understand or change feature flags is really important to be able to set up state. They weren't using any of the kind of WebDriver BiDi capabilities that existed. So for me, it made sense that we would switch to using WebDriver I/O for the Selenium piece. With WebDriver I/O, we get web-first assertions. With WebDriver I/O, we have automatic waiting. We have the stale element retries. We had the intercepting and mocking via Puppeteer, now with BiDi. We're an e-commerce company, so being able to run a subset of our tests on mobile as a first-class citizen is really important. WebDriver I/O provides a really nice Appium integration. And then kind of as a callback to understanding the context, understanding the good things that are there, there's a lot of really good libraries written for accessing databases and written for accessing APIs in TypeScript. We still wanted to be able to use those. But we've been here before. So again, kind of understanding the context. Over the previous few years, they changed multiple times. They went from Selenium with C#, Selenium with Java, Protractor with TypeScript, where you have Angular front ends. But Protractor gets end-of-lifed, and the team switches over to using Selenium. So whenever I started initially broaching this subject with my boss, who at that time was the head of quality, he literally put his head in his hands at the mere idea of changing again. So it wasn't necessarily going to be easy to make my case. But I had an opportunity. So one of the things that I was tasked with whenever I joined was being able to establish successful synthetic monitoring of our e-commerce sites loading their checkout pages in production. This was something that had been attempted for about a year before I joined, using the existing Selenium and Cucumber automation. But for the reasons I had mentioned, things weren't quite as good as they could have been. You don't want a flaky test waking you up for a false alarm in production. But I knew, based on my own experience, based on having used WebDriver IO, that I could probably do this with WebDriver IO. So I set about introducing competition. I had a little bit of a window when I was onboarding to be able to do some pilot work that would be able to showcase some of the potential improvements that doing this would provide. Going back to Gherkin for a moment. If you want to run a data-driven scenario in Gherkin, you might do something like this, where you have an example table, and for every row in the example table, the scenario will execute from start to finish. We wanted to be able to have our synthetic monitoring tests essentially have one test, and then for a particular customer, load the checkout in production across multiple different countries. To see it across 3, 10, 30 countries, no matter whatever it might have been. In WebDriver IO, if you want to run the same test in parallel, you can do this quite easily out of the box if you're happy to specify different browsers to run it in. But we're not interested in running in different browsers. We're interested in running with different countries. So at the time, there was a little, at least for me, known ability to specify custom capabilities where you can basically pass any kind of arbitrary data to the config and then read that in your test. And then that test is now running in parallel for each country that you specify in the config. So we're going from having a Gherkin scenario running sequentially for each row in the table to having something that will just scale out. So over a period of about a month, ran the two solutions side by side to be able to see the performance, showing whenever WebDriver IO test failed, it failed for the right reason, and didn't fail perhaps whenever the existing solution failed. But in some ways, this was solving quite a niche problem. Additionally, I could see my boss was starting to be convinced, but he was not going to be writing test automation. We needed to get to a kind of wider proposal for all the other tests that would exist pre-production. We needed these tests to have attributes like these: reliability, speed, maintainability, but also ideas around how you reveal intent in your tests. In terms of the speed, I mentioned that we had that ability to easily run things in parallel. But every benchmark I took in terms of individual tests, whenever I converted an existing test, WebDriver IO was quicker. But it actually wasn't that WebDriver I/O was quicker. It was to do the abstraction layers that had been put in place and to attempt to deal with the raw Selenium API. We still needed to deal with intention. We still needed to deal with maintainability. At the start, we talked about writing good Gherkin. And one of the ideas we talked about was what versus how. We can still take those ideas and apply them to code. So being able to say and provide guidelines to say your tests cannot, should not, for the most part, have these implementation details if it's clicking a button or if it's possibly even worse, making direct API calls or database calls in a test. It needs to be all taken away. And your test should read in the language of the domain things that actually make sense, adding items, authorizing, placing orders. But you don't kind of just get this for free. One of the best blogs I read for helping me think about this is from a guy, Blake Norrish, where he talks about this literary idea of Chekhov's gun, where if you specify as an author that you have a gun on the mantelpiece, you're compelled as the author that that gun will be fired later on in the book. And as he says, take this idea, apply it to your tests, apply it to your variables. If you have a variable there, and it's not adding meaning to your test, think of ways to remove it, so that what you're left with is variables that have meaning, have context. But it's also kind of fractal. So it's not just variables, it's page objects. It could be any different kind of abstractions that you've used that you need to think about and strip down. In practice, there's lots of different ways to think about this, and it's probably a whole different talk. But being able to specify factories and builders, these are things people will be pretty familiar with, I think. But having sensible defaults where you're only exposing extra detail as necessary. But whenever I'm doing an e-commerce checkout flow, yes, I might need to add an item to a cart. Yes, I might need to fill in a shipping address and a billing address. I might need to say which payment type I'm going to use. But really what I'm doing is placing an order with Visa. I'm placing an order with PayPal. I'm doing it in Turkey. I'm doing it in Hungary, whatever it might be. Having your tests actually at that level communicates the intent. So being able to use different types of facades or orchestration layers over your different levels helps facilitate that. I'm missing a slide. Interesting. So, okay. So we had three different kind of audiences that I needed to convince around the test automation. We had developers, we had test automation specialists, and we had testers, or people who didn't code as much as the other people. Talking about these ideas to the developers was pretty straightforward. So I started talking with the developers that had previously taken an interest in the test automation, show them that there was, in my view, a better way. For the testers, some of the reasons given for using Cucumber and some of the decisions were based, again, that idea, if anybody can read it, well, then maybe anybody can contribute and write tests. But I'm very much of the view that rather than, in a sense, dumb down our automation, we need to raise the people up. The biggest challenge, though, came from the existing test automation specialists. These were the people who had created what was already there. They had a lot of emotional attachment to what they had done, naturally. They were very much of the firm belief that what they had done solved lots and lots of problems. And I faced an awful lot of resistance. And whenever I was starting to think about this and deal with the challenging environment, I came across this book from Michael Stahl from quite a few years ago now, The title says the field test automation projects, but as it says in the introduction, a lot of these ideas can apply even to good test automation. The chapter I actually particularly like is around the nighttime fallacy, but I was using the one from the competition. So the context or the situation that he uses is a little bit different than the one I was in because I had introduced the competition. But some of the ideas, some of the lessons remained the same. Now, as I said earlier, I had joined as the most senior test automation person, so that helped for a start. But I needed to do this. I needed to say, without any shadow of a doubt, that this was happening. Because as Michael says, as long as the people think, as long as they come up with the right argument, they'll be able to convince me, in this case, to change my mind or not do what I wanted to do. So I talked to the most vocal people and said, this is happening. I hope you're going to join me on this journey. And that's what I did. So where are we now? I did this slide 6 months, or this presentation 6 months ago as well. So yeah, we're well beyond having migrated our test to WebDriver I/O. We have more coverage than we ever had as we've continued to extend, as we have testers contributing to the test automation without using Cucumber. We have test code that evolves as, particularly my understanding of the domain has changed and grown, but also as the applications have changed and grown. And we have actual real readability, but real readability in code, but applying those principles that Cucumber talks about. So I know there's another question slide, and I'll just stick up the references, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Hugh. Cheers for that presentation. And let's see if we have any questions. We have a few minutes for the Q&A session. Yes, we do. Writing Gherkin tests the what way instead of how can greatly limit test stop reusability in other tests. Isn't this a big drawback?
I guess it depends on implementation. Whenever I was kind of talking about the exposing as necessary, so it isn't that you just have the top layer and that's the only thing you can use. It is likely you're composing that top layer out of other layers that kind of come together to make that facade. So, and then you don't restrict access to the lower layers. And if you're using some kind of ideas around composition over inheritance, you probably still provide access so you can use those bits and pieces as needed. So it is not an all or nothing situation.
From Anthony, what is your advice from test architectural perspective for executing quick and effective QA tech stack change? Tools don't matter.
What's your advice? Sorry, what is your advice? QA tech stack change.
Wow.
I'm not sure I can quite parse that question.
Well, if you can't figure it out, I certainly can't, that's for sure. Is Anthony here? Can he clarify what he's asking?
No.
He's not here? Okay. Bruno, what do you recommend for a team that uses Java and Selenium for testing, but are interested in WebDriver I/O?
I think what problem are you trying to solve is the first question. Is there something about WebDriver I/O specifically that other solutions might not also solve for you? So quite a few years ago now, I used Selenide. So Selenide is a Java framework for Selenium. Got a lot of really nice ideas implemented into it, similar, I think, to WebDriver I/O. I haven't used it in years, so I guessing. I don't know if it has an app-im integration, but it still comes back to what problem you're actually trying to solve. Is there something about WebDriver I/O that you actually want or need? But as I said, in Java, there is a really nice open source framework, Selnide, that also provides a really nice experience.
Okay, Mikhail asks, what was your favorite way to track test coverage, feature, or component level?
So we're actually having a little bit of a discussion about this right now. We haven't done anything formal yet, but one thing or one item that we're looking to explore is tying in with observability. So if we're able to, as part of our test automation, specify a trace ID as part of the initial requests, and then compare that to the actual usage in production, again through observability, we should be able to do a comparison between what's happening and then seeing, OK, we may be starting in a browser, but we should be able to see the journey going through all the different APIs that end up being called.
And Tiago Ferreiro Machado asks, which was the biggest challenge during this whole process?
The people piece, yeah. Yeah, the people piece by some distance. The actual test automation piece, it's fine. Done it many times. Comfortable with not knowing things early on, but they will become known. But dealing with quite a large organization, quite a lot of people that you then had to change minds and convince.
Okay, and the last question is, was the pipeline split between API and GUI stages?
Yes. Yeah, it's just whatever is required. I mean, it depends on the nature of your test. If you're testing the browser, actually testing what's in the browser, well, that's a different test than if you are doing an end-to-end journey that might be crossing multiple domains. Of course, there's other ways to approach this from a risk perspective, but if you're going to do the end-to-end test, naturally at some point, or perhaps ideally, you'll be using APIs to put that journey together for you. And in my last company, we did that quite a lot. So we had something like 70% of our end-to-end journey tests were pure API calls together, modeled and chained together. OK, that's the questions. If you have any other questions that you think about, you can find Hugh here, out there in the hallway. Corner him and ask him your question. Other than that, let's give Mr. McCamphill a big round of applause. Cheers.